So which Fire Emblem game is harder? Fire Emblem Engage or Fire Emblem Three Houses? And this is in regards to Maddening difficulty. Now, I've played both games for quite a while. I have probably 800 hours on Three Houses Maddening, so I've done a bunch of different runs. I've done a bunch of normal runs, normal Maddening runs, runs without DLC and online runs where I just only skipped. I didn't do auxiliary battles, paralogs. I didn't do explore like the monastery. Like I just skipped. So like I didn't even allow seminar. Those were very difficult. Now that being said, before I started playing Engage on Maddening, I had just beaten Fire Emblem Three Houses Maddening by doing skip only run for Blue Lions and for Silver Snow. And Blue Lions was definitely the harder of the two, but that was definitely one of the hardest things I've ever done in a Fire Emblem game. So that being said, how does the base game Maddening compare, like excluding challenge runs, because skip only is a huge challenge run? And how does this game's difficulty compare in terms of like a challenge run? Now, I personally haven't done challenge runs on this game, but I think for stock Maddening, it goes to Engage. I think Engage is much harder. Engage will punish your mistakes more, and it's way harder to break. On this map, I have a few flying units in a corner, and I'm kind of cheesing it, but this is a randomly generated skirmish. This is not a mainline mission. And even so, it was difficult to produce this result. But this is a good situation to just chill out, kill some enemies, and talk about both games. So the thing with Engage is that if your units are out of position, it's not so much that you die and lose. Usually what will happen is you just need them somewhere else. And Engage is heavy on reinforcements, and it tends to try to overwhelm you. And if you don't use your abilities correctly, it will destroy you. In Three Houses Maddening, you can usually take things at your own pace. And one of the key differences between the two games is that Three Houses allows you to break down maps slowly, making gradual progress. And there are a few maps where the map rushes you and you have to kind of deal with it, but it's not like the entire map, and it's kind of like in waves. So Engage, it's very common for middle game to end game maps to just overwhelm you with enemy density and to just try to, kill you really quickly. They'll try to overwhelm you. So that's one of the huge differences between the two games. The main way in which Engage, I think, is harder is that excluding DLC, because I do think the DLC makes the game easier. Like, it gives you resources, and this is true in Three Houses as well. Both of those games' DLCs will make Maddening much easier. The thing with this game is that even if you have broken tools and you know how to use them, it still isn't enough sometimes. And if you have a bad position and you've just made like fundamental positional mistakes, you will lose over time. And there's also certain things to prevent you from cheesing things. Now, you can still cheese a lot of things because it's Fire Emblem, so warp strats are still very viable in a lot of maps. But most enemy bosses have multiple health bars, so you can't just kill them one turn and end the map. So you can still do this, it's just harder. But the main way in which Engage is more difficult is the fact that you have less mobility. So even mounted units have generally 6 movement instead of 7 to 8. The only mounted units with 6 in Three Houses are Pegasus Knights, and that's like a beginner class that transitions into Falcon Knight eventually, which has 8 movement. They got rid of Canto. So Canto is if you have 8 movement, for example, and you move 4 tiles and attack, you get to move 4 tiles back. They replaced it with an optional unlockable ability that takes time to get, called Canter, where you can move 2 spaces after acting. The upside of Canter is you can move your maximum distance, act, and then move further. The downside is that you can't do bounce tactics where you move in, hit, and then get out. There's also no combat arts, so the only time you can use special abilities is when you pop an engage meter. And when you do that, you're engaged for so many turns. You have access to a gambit-like ability, and you also have access to like a secondary ability. So each engage has like a primary and a secondary ability. So it's very similar to having access to a combat art or having access to like some utility option as well as a gambit, and you can use them infrequently, similar to gambits in Three Houses. Now, Three Houses has a lot of gambits that easily break the game. It also has a lot of classes that easily break the game. Even when you run the best setups on Engage, there's still levels where it like completely destroys me. Even though I've done really difficult Three Houses content, like challenge runs, and also I understand most of the metagame of this game, there are still times where I'll be on like an end game level and I'll just make like a few positional mistakes and like a unit is like 1 or 2 tiles too far away, like fighting some other enemy on the flank or something, and I'm just like missing resources. Whereas with like Three Houses, that almost never happens because you have access to so much. You have 2 warps per map, per chapter, or battle on your units. That's free. Your spell tomes are free. Like in this game, your weapons are free. But your warps are not free in this game. They're very expensive, and there's a finite amount of them, so you can't use warp every map. You can't use rescue every map. It was a very common tactic in Three Houses to attack something and then rescue it. Or rescue an ally that's far away to pull them to you, and then they can go help your team or do something. In this game, that's just not a thing. There is still rescue. It's not as effective. The range isn't as good. Same thing with warp. And the only way to make it really good is if you use Micaiah. And even so, there's only so many rescues and warps you can even get in the game, and then they just runs out. So if you use them too much, you will just run out. So in that way, it's more balanced. I would say of the two, Engage is definitely harder by default. Once you kind of know the tricks of Three Houses Maddening, like what the enemies do with like the Past Thieves and the Poison Strike 3-range archers, you start to get a feel for it. You start to get used to it, and it's just kind of like fighting the same things over and over again. Whereas with this game, they introduced new mechanics, they introduced new map functionality. So there's things like cannons. So like I can go over here and shoot a cannon, makes fire tiles. The fire tiles delay movement on ground units. There's things like that. There's maps where like water rises and lowers, and there's like destructible buildings, and there's darkness. There's definitely more like put on the player and more mechanical map things, like more map mechanics that Three Houses frankly lacks completely. Like Three Houses maps, it generally feels like you're just fighting the same types of enemies and they just get stronger over time. Whereas in this game, they introduce like map mechanics. Like chapter 24, for example, has an avalanche mechanic where there's 3 lanes you have to push up on a mountain, and every 2 turns, one of them gets hit with an avalanche and it pushes all of your units down to the bottom. And you can like reposition on rocks, and then you get caught on rocks so you don't lose all your progress. But that's just one example. As well as like the one with like the beach level where there's water that rises. There's like high and low tide. And when it's high tide, the mobility's bad because everyone's stuck in water. And there's all these different interesting things. And between the two of the games, I would say Engage really keeps you on your toes a lot by just like randomly blindsiding you with like crazy mechanics you weren't expecting. Whereas with Three Houses, as long as you understand how to attack enemies, like you just poke them with like curve shot or whatever that long range attack is. I can't remember the name of it. It has like 5 range. I think Deadly Eye? or Deadeye? Yeah, Deadeye. You can use Deadeye at 5 range, poke an enemy, get like a group of 4 to 5 enemies to push you, you kill them, you just keep doing that, and that's how you beat the maps easily. You can't really do that in Engage. Some enemies will ignore you if you attack them. So if you like poke them with some long range attack that doesn't kill them, they're not going to aggro. Some enemies delay aggro on purpose. So like enemies will sometimes use siege weapons. These are randomly generated skirmish enemies, so they're not going to use this against me, but if this was the actual map, this is chapter 19? I think it's 19 or 18. The enemies actually would use the cannon against you. So like enemies will use siege weapons against you. There are enemies that warp groups of enemies to you. So like the enemies use warp combos on you. Like it's actually pretty crazy. This game will really trip you up sometimes because it uses some tactics players typically use against the player. And in that way, it's very interesting. So right now I'm just clearing up this map. This isn't even a mainline mission, and I'm basically abusing this map with flyers to some degree. But I don't know. I could probably beat it legit. It would just take like 2 hours and require a lot of critical thinking. And honestly, like almost every battle in this game will push you to like break down positions and will force you to calculate way more than Three Houses ever will. And honestly, for that reason alone, this game is way harder. It's not even close. And this is coming from someone who's just done a Three Houses skip-only run for Blue Lions. And if you don't understand what that does, so skip only run in Maddening is at the end of every week, there's every month you have like 1 to I don't know 4 weekends. Every weekend you can choose battle to do paralogs or auxiliary battles. You can do seminar to increase your proficiency in certain skills from the instructor and raise motivation. And then you can do explore, which is when you do like the fishing, getting certain things, getting quests, unlocking stuff, doing saint statues. By doing skip only, you deprive yourself of so many resources. You will end up with under-leveled units and a tight economy, and you'll basically be almost broke the entire time. And there's a lot of strain on your resources. Your units are bad. You have to spend like 2 to 3 units turns, sometimes 4, to kill a single enemy. So it's extremely high stress and difficult, and it's not easy at all. So having gone from that to Engage, and Engage is still very difficult, speaks to Engage's design. Now there are some things that are broken, but me using this flyer strat is just like a drop in the ocean compared to all the things you can use to break Three Houses. This is like a day. This is a day in the life in Three Houses. If this were Three Houses, I would move to here, curve shot, move back, and just kill all these, and they would never counterattack me ever. So this is literally not nearly as bad as the stuff you can do in Three Houses by far. By default, Three Houses has like 5 uses of Impregnable Wall, Goddess Dance combos. It has like that like shield ability that makes it so that you take 0 damage from enemy range attacks. It has a lot of crazy things. I can start to move down here, I guess. None of these guys have range, so I'm just going to continue killing them in this way. Now, if I were playing this map normally, there's no way I could do this video, like, and talk and think about the differences between the games, because I'd have to be calculating so much. And in Three Houses, that's not something you really need to do. Three Houses, you just have to, like, check for, like, lethal damage. Whereas with this game, you have to think about, okay, if I don't stall these enemies with an ability, or if I don't put a tank here, or if I don't do this, these 4 enemies are going to push me, and then next turn someone will die because we'll be overwhelmed. So how do I solve that? And then how do I kill these 3 enemies? And there's like some flying enemies coming in. There's reinforcements in a turn that come from here. Like there's so many variables to calculate. Whereas in Three Houses, the only thing you really need to be concerned with at worst are like reinforcements. And they're planned reinforcements. This game has way more reinforcements than Three Houses. By far. This game treats reinforcements like it needs as many as humanly possible. It has like this game's reinforcements are much worse than Three Houses. It's not even comparable. Between the two, this game's reinforcements on mainline missions can really stress you out because like you'll think so. All right, so in terms of solving the position, there's another thing to talk about here where if you've ever played chess, okay, and if you haven't, I'll explain what the hell I'm talking about. All right, so in chess, there's the opening, there's the middle game, and then there's the end game. And these sections of the game typically are about as long as each other. Sometimes, the middle game is long. Sometimes the end game is long. The opening is usually the first few moves, right? So the opening is typically the shortest, and then you have the longer middle game, and then the longer, sometimes longest end game. Because sometimes you have a complicated end game where you have to make a bunch of weird pawn and king moves to push your opponent's king out of the way, to check him, and then make space, and then get a queen and checkmate. But in Three Houses, you generally experience combat in terms of waves. So you have like an opening, a middle game, and then an end game, and then that's like phase 1 of a map, right? And then you have another one of those, and that's like phase 2, and then you have another one of those, and that's phase 3, and then the map is over. The way I would describe Engage is you have an opening, a middle game for a long time, and then you have an end game. There's no pauses. There's no breaks between it. So you are in calculation mode, figuring out how to break down the enemy formations, reposition, maneuver. And also you don't have Kanto, and you don't have like a ton of abilities that easily allow you to just like sit there and tank damage. Now, Lucina Bond Shield is like one of the few abilities that allows this, but arguably Impregnable Wall is much better because with Impregnable Wall, you can have all of your units attack a bunch of things, then use Impregnable Wall with a single unit, and then Kanto away. So that like the things that could get hit take 1 damage, so they're guaranteed to tank. Whereas with Bond Shield, there's still some degree of risk. It's harder to use, I would say. It's harder to set things up because things can go wrong with it. With Impregnable Wall, you're basically guaranteed to not die ever. With Bond Shield, they can still get killed by like certain mechanics if they hit multiple times, for example. Or if the enemies have backup units, which contribute to chain attacks that pierce armor and pierce effects like Bond Shield. But this game has way more calculation, and if you found Three Houses maddening difficult, you will probably find this game's maddening much harder. And the only way that that wouldn't be the case is if you looked up a ton of guides. And I honestly, I think that's the only case in which it wouldn't be harder, is if you looked up a ton of guides. But even so, even with a lot of information from a lot of the guides, I would say guides break Three Houses way easier than they do in this game. So one thing I can do here, you can still do trading to manipulate weapons. So like, for example, if she has a heavy-ass weapon, switch those. Oops, meant to grab the heal. Another thing too, there's restrictions on trading. In Three Houses, you can trade as many people as you want and then do something. In this game, you can only trade one person. You see that's no longer present, and then you have to do something. Same thing with Convoy. So you have to at least consider what you're going to be trading and why. And if you make a mistake, that's it. Now, this game does default to 10 pulses, but I think it's just to avoid frustration on the player's part. Oh, he got a crit. Because things like that happen, so that's why they have pulses. To be honest, that's also why I would never do an Iron Man run. Because dumb little things like that always happen. I manipulated the thing so she wouldn't get one round, and then she got crit, so... Alright, so what I can do here, I can actually get them to move down just by parking a unit. So they can't hit her here, so I can just shoot this. And then move down to. They don't have range. But doing this is very hard. It's not easy to pull this type of thing off in this game. Whereas in Three Houses, everyone can get curve shot, and you can easily just spam curve shot and beat maps without even thinking. And it's just an issue of having enough units to spam curve shot or some combat art to kill enemies over time. Whereas with this game, spamming will lose you the game, 100%. You have to critically think about what you're doing on most of your turns, and if you don't, you will just straight up lose. So you definitely need to evaluate more in this game by a huge margin. Like, so much so that, like, I found myself the other day, I'm like, all right, I'm going to take a break from this game. But to be fair, I have played it for 240 hours since it's launched. And that's, like, more than 12 hours a day in some cases. At least it was for a while. Maybe I did take enough of a break where I'm no longer averaging 12 hours a day. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. Honestly, this game is much harder, I think. Now, with challenge runs, if you did, like, a no emblem ring run, that would be pretty hard. That would definitely be harder than skip only, for sure. This game's enemy density is ridiculous. Now, there might be exploits, like, you know, certain things like dodge tanks and certain units and certain archetypes you could abuse to mitigate that, and maybe it wouldn't be so bad. But if you're playing the game as intended, meaning you're not using, like, some obvious broken thing, like 100% avoid rate units and stuff like that, it's a very hard game. And there's not that many ways to mitigate that outside of exploiting things. But yeah, I think that's it for this one. Feel free to drop a comment. Let me know if you think Three Houses is harder. I'd like to know why. Me personally, I think this game is much harder. And I think Three Houses can be broken a lot easier. Both games can be broken. I think, like most Fire Emblem games, it's true that they can be broken. I don't think there's very many Fire Emblem games that can't easily be broken. And I don't know if that's by design or it's like they just don't care. They're like, yeah, whatever, just let people break the game. But yeah, that's it for this one. Definitely like and subscribe. Peace.